We are on Chaf Amud Beis 20b. So let's re-identify the three layers of the discussion we just mentioned yesterday. The beginning of it is Rabbi Meir, who we learned was a scribe for a living, and he studied under the tutelage of both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. We discussed the order in which that might have happened. One of his two teachers, either Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Yishmael, was okay with the fact that he added kankantum to the ink, kankantum being some sort of sulfate, so Rabbi Steinsaltz translates it, and essentially what this kankantum does is it helps the ink stick to the parchment. So one of his two teachers was okay with it, and the other one was not okay with it. As for Rabbi Meir's practice himself, what was Rabbi Meir's practice himself? What did he do? What was his view? So the Gemara cites two opinions, and this is layer number one of the discussion. Rabbi Yehuda says that he added kankantum to all ink, whether it's writing tefillin, mezuzah, sefer Torah, with the exception of writing the Sotah. This means not just when he wrote the Sotah to be used in the temple, but even when he wrote the laws of the Sotah in the actual Torah. He's writing a Torah, and there's half a chapter that discusses the laws of Sotah. So throughout the entirety of the Torah, he would add kankantum, the sulfite, to the ink. But when it came to the section describing the Sotah, he would not. This is Rabbi Akiva's view, Rabbi Yehuda's view. Rabbi Yaakov, however, says no. He always used sulfite for everything, including the section of the Torah that describes the Sotah. The only exception to when he did not add sulfite is when he was writing a text that was going to be used in the temple for an actual Sotah. Following the dispute? This was layer one of the discussion. The Gemara added layer two and said, okay, here's the reason why they're disputing here. Rabbi Yehuda is of the view that when you write a Sotah, one second, what was level number two?
The intent, was it about
That's right.
intent?
That's right. So what was level number three then? What was number three? Oh, sorry. Yeah, level number two is, can you use the text of the Torah for a Sotah? Meaning, say the Torah was invalidated and it's time to bury the Torah, respectfully buried, as is done with the Torah that's rendered Shemus, it's rendered invalid, Shemus or Geniza, however you refer to it. So can you cut out the section of the Torah that describes the Sotah and use that for a woman in the temple? Rabbi Yehuda is of the view, yes, you may. And because you may, therefore Rabbi Yehuda said, don't add sulfite to that section of the Torah, lest you might need to use it in this temple and have to erase it, because the sulfite will make it impossible for you to erase. And when it comes to the Sotah, you have to erase the text. So don't write that part of the Torah with sulfite, because one day you might need to use it in the temple. That's only possible if you're of the view that a cutout from the Torah that describes the Sotah is usable for the Sotah in the temple. Clear? Is that clear?
It is, but I can't see the Torah being cut up even if it's being buried.
In some ways, you might say we're salvaging. At least some part of it's being used for something.
That's like saying I'm burying your body, but I'm taking your kidneys.
Okay, look, some people might say that's okay.
But it's not okay.
One's a body, one's a Torah. I'm just saying, we have to remember something like this. There's two issues here. One is whether we understand it, and number two is understanding what he says. Right now, we don't have. We have to remember we're learning Gemara.
No,
we don't pick sides on who's right and who's wrong.
Right,
we just have to understand what they're thinking. So, whether you have a counter argument or anything else.
I'm thinking there's two things I'm thinking. One is you're not changing the ink for one paragraph in the Torah. It has to be uniform all the way through. In my head, that's the way it should be. And two, even though the Torah is still invalid and it's not kosher and we're burying it, we're not going to make it even less unkosher.
Okay, so the exercise for proper learning Gemara would be to change that and to come to the point where you understand what he's saying. Because the premise is if he said it, he's right, because it's in the Gemara. And if we are lacking understanding, then the deficiency is in us, not in the Gemara. Right? No, I understand your premise. I understand where you're coming from, and that might be the argument the other way, right? But well, actually, the argument the other way isn't that either. The argument the other way is that you cannot use a section of Torah for the Sotah, akarat. That's the other. That would be Rabbi Yaakov's view,
right?
Which is why he says you do use a self-light for that section of Torah, right? Now, the next layer of the dispute has nothing to do with whether we're treating the Torah properly. The question is, and this is layer number 3, when you write the text of a Sotah for a woman in the actual temple where you're going to erase the ink, do you have to write it with the intent that it's for this specific woman? If the answer is yes, then you cannot use the passage from the Torah. If the answer is no, then you may use the passage from the Torah. So the root of the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yaakov is not a question of respecting the Torah or not. It's a question of the laws of the Sotah.
Right. Okay.
Right. So it would seem then that if you can use something for a mitzvah, then use it for a mitzvah.
It's going to be buried in.
Yeah. It's being buried respectfully. No, of course I understand what you're saying. But remember, like we can understand if it takes tomorrow, but we have to remember that our understanding is because we lack understanding of what's happening here. So the exercise then becomes to try to figure out what it means here. So let's just assume, we can take it very simply. Let's put it this way. For someone who says, like using the example of the body, someone who says that he wants to donate his kidneys to science, the person is lacking logic because Torah says to bury the whole body. Torah says to bury the whole body, so we won't do it. Fine, get it. But logically speaking, it makes perfect sense. In fact, in halacha, if you can salvage, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of organ donation, but the short of it of organ donation is that there's a dispute as to exactly when is the moment of death. Right? That's the big dispute. And those few moments of when the moment of death is will change whether or not you can do, let's say, a heart transplant or a lung transplant or something like that. Yeah, those few moments. And by halachic standards, the moment that you would, the level of life you would need to do a transplant, at least for certain organs, would constitute murder because the guy's still alive by Torah law. His death only happens a little while later. Because his death only happens a little while later, if you took the organ out earlier, it's murder by Torah law. So this is the dispute between the science and Torah. It's exactly what's the moment of death. I don't want to say it's a dispute between science and Torah because the science is kind of lopsided. Because science doesn't think of the moment of death as much as the viability of life. So if they know, as a matter of fact, this person is going to die in a minute, they have no qualms taking out the guy's lungs because he's going to die in a minute. Who cares? But Torah doesn't look at the viability of life so much as, is he alive at the moment? If the answer is yes, don't take the lungs or the heart, whatever it is. But however, there are certain organs that do survive post even halachic death. I think specifically the liver. I could be completely missing which organ it is, but I do know for sure that there's at least one organ, or maybe even more, that survived past the moment of halachic death. And by Torah law, that can be donated, even though it's not going to be buried. Why? Because it's going to save somebody else's life, so why not use it? So that would be the logic as to why you can cut out the Torah to use it for another mitzvah. There's a organization called HODS, H-O-D-S, Halachic Organ Donation Society. And over there, they have a special donor card that stipulates that you have to be halachically dead before they sell it, before they take any part of your body for somebody else. And there's different levels of, even within halacha, as to exactly which the moment of death, and that would change which organs you can use and not or use. But it's a beautiful organization and has lots of rabbinic support that's greater than way greater than my authority, whatever little authority I have. But I will caution that you have to remember that when you sign that document, you're trusting that the doctors there are actually going to follow through the document. So when you're lying, when someone, God forbid, is lying on the deathbed, they don't have the cognition to say, "Hey, are you following the orders of the paper?"
Right. And who even knows that the paper exists? Well,
when you sign into the hospital, they'll ask you at the beginning, do you have an organ donation card? Sure. They'll ask you the details, but you're trusting that the doctors actually follow the paper that you gave them. let's just assume you gave it to them, right? Assume you gave it to them. They fought, and there's a lot of emotion at play, and it's seconds. It's a question of seconds. The doctor has to make a decision. Can I take the lung or not take the lung?
Family's bearing down on the.
Yeah, and they're supposed to, exactly. They're supposed to remember. That's right. They're supposed to remember which thing is what. So it's very difficult to. I would have a very strong caution before one person signs that, but nonetheless, this organization exists, and I know in Israel for sure it's certainly rather successful, because over there I've seen, especially certain hospitals, I imagine most of them are very well aware of the halakhic implications and what's going on and what. So maybe there it's a little less tricky than here in Canada, where you're relying on a random doctor that you don't know or may never know. But anyway, the point is still there. So that's right. Not here in Montreal. I don't think in Israel either. You're relying on the good faith of the doctor to follow through on the papers you gave them, right? And then what's going to happen? The family's going to sue if you took the wrong thing. But God forbid the person anyways lost with a part of his organ that he was murdered essentially 5 seconds before he was going to die anyway. He's still murdered by Torah law.
So it's almost like embryonic condition. Child when it's conceived.
Yeah, abortion.
Abortion and all this.
For question of abortion. It's the inverse of that, yeah. At which point is considered life. But Torah has actually a tricky position there, which again, we're not going to go into right now. It's another time, maybe. You know what? Maybe for our Thursday night shuvas, there's an interesting shuvah on abortion, which gets into the moment of when we'll learn that once. That'll be interesting. If I'm not mistaken, it's from the Tzitz Eliezer. I have to look it up. Anyway, okay. So where are we? So again, 3 layers of dispute. Do you add sulfite to the section of the Torah describing the Sotah? That's Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Huda. That's what they said. We added another layer. The dispute is built on the fact as to whether or not you're allowed to use a cutout of the Torah for this woman. And that's built on a layer 3, which is, do you have to have in mind which one you're writing for when you're writing the Sotah? Right? This is our stacking thing. What the Gemara is going to do is, the Gemara is now going to disconnect level 2 from level 3. That's what the Gemara is about to do. And say that irrespective of your position on level 3, meaning you could say that a Sotah woman, that you cannot use the text of one Sotah woman for another Sotah woman. And yet you can still use the text of the Torah. Because we're going to differentiate between lack of intent or intent for a different woman. In the Torah, there's no intent for anyone, and therefore maybe it could be used. Whereas when it comes to using the Sotah text you wrote for one woman, and then transferring that to a different woman, that's not allowed. Or maybe they are linked. That's what the Gemara is about to do. Clear? So let's see. Amar Papa. Papa stated, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines from the top of the page, second to last word. Amar Rav, and then the next line begins with the word Papa, which is the 8th line. See it? 20b. 20b, 7 lines down, second to last word, Amar Rav Papa.
Yeah, okay.
Amar Rav Papa stated, Dilma perhaps, loihi. We cannot stack the two together. We cannot say that if you dispute regarding whether you may or may not use the section of the Torah is not necessarily stacked on the question of whether you may use a Sotah text written for one woman who backed out and then use that for another woman. The two aren't stacked upon each other. How's that? Perhaps the first scholar, the sages, did not go so far as to say, Hassam over there, with respect to a Sotah text that was written for one woman who backed out, and now you want to use it for somebody else. Ella, they only said over there it's not allowed, because it's already been attached and assigned to Rachel, random woman. You cannot now uproot the original intent you gave it for a specific woman and attach it to another woman, Leah. But Torah, a person who uses the text of the Torah, the stomach siva, which was written with no intent, not for one woman, not for another, it was written just for its own sake. Perhaps the sages would still agree that yes, you can use that cutout. So we cannot stack those two. In other words, there's a dispute as to whether or not you can use a Sotah woman, a text you wrote for a Sotah woman, and then that woman blacked out. Can you use a text for another woman? Sages say no, and Rabbi Achi Bar Yeshaya said yes. So if you say yes, right, then certainly you can use a Torah text. Because if you can use a text that was written for one woman and transfer it to another, certainly you can use a text that was written for nobody.
It's even more broader.
That's right. But the sages who said, no, you cannot use it for the woman, and we want to say that is attached to the fact that you wouldn't use the text of the Torah, says now, Papa, no. Maybe the reason why the sages said you cannot take this text and pass it to another woman is because this has already been assigned to someone. But the Torah, which hasn't been assigned to anybody, maybe you could use that cutout. Clear?
Yeah.
Now the Gemara goes the other way.
They didn't have the Torah scroll in mind when they created this limitation.
Exactly. They specifically had in mind.
They were thinking of it in terms of
That's right.
women
That's correct.
That's already been assigned.
That's right. The limitation is only when the text has been assigned to a specific woman. Many can't transfer. But that doesn't mean that a text of a Torah, which is not assigned to anybody, you can't. Maybe you could use, now assign it, cut it out and assign it to somebody. Exactly. Now the Gemara goes the other way. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Dilma Loyi, perhaps we cannot. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Rav Nachman son of Yitzchak. Now he addresses Rabbi Achi bar Yoshia's opinion, which is, Ad kan loy ka'amar Rabbi Achi bar Yoshia. When did Rabbi Achi bar Yoshia say you're allowed to take? Rabbi Achi bar Yoshia was the one who said you're allowed to take a text of a certain woman that has been assigned to one woman, and she backed out. You can now take and use it for another woman. Rabbi Achi bar Yoshia said that, and we assume if that's the case, then certainly you can use the text of the Torah, right? That's what we assumed, right?
Right.
Says the Gemara, no, let's cut.
More broader.
That's right. Says the Gemara, let's cut that. No. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, no, cut that, sever that connection. Because Hassam over there, the reason why Rabbi Achi bar Yoshia allows you to transfer the text of a site that was written for one woman for another, at least this text was assigned to the cursing of a woman. So you're transferring it from one woman to another, but at least it was assigned for the cursing of a woman. Aval Torah, but the text of the Torah, the Islamic ksiva, right, was written not to curse anybody, but for study. And now you're going to turn it into a curse? Can't do that. So the Gemara severs it on both sides. So the dispute is not stacked at all. Wherever you stand on the question of transferring the text of one Sotah woman to another has no bearing on whether or not you can use the text of the Torah. Because both sides. You can say the reason why I'm putting a limitation on transferring from one woman to another is because it's been assigned to one woman. And the Torah text you may use. And you can, on the other hand, say, oh, the reason why I'm allowing you to transfer from one woman to another is because this text was written for curse, whereas the Torah text is written for study. And you can't take a study text and turn it into a curse. That sounds more like your argument. Right, Scott? That's kind of like you were saying. That a Torah text, which is written for the sake of study, what, you're going to cut it out and using that to curse a woman? You can't do that. And that actually is the halacha. Rabbi Achi bar Yoshia could say, no erasing. Because this is a text of a Torah that's written for there. So bottom line is, that layer 3 and layer 2 are not attached, not connected, because there's arguments both ways. No matter where you stand in layer 3, whether you can transfer a text of a certain woman from one to another has no bearing on what your opinion is as to whether you can use a cutout of a Torah for a certain woman. Because there's arguments to connect them and arguments to detach them on both sides of the coin. Clear? Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop over here because the Gemara is now going to add another twist, which I think we had enough twist, a little bit of twisting ready for today. Another twist is coming. God willing, tomorrow we're going to do a little mental exercise again and compare this law of the Sotah to the law of a divorce document, which the Torah also prescribes that the text of the Torah, the text of the divorce document, the get, must be written for the sake of that specific woman. And we're going to compare that to the law of the Sotah. And we'll look at the text of the Sotah and see, does indeed the Torah say that it has to be written for her? And in what context does the Torah say it has to be written for her? That's going to be done tomorrow as we compare it to the law of divorce. And that'll add another
Because they want
twist to this
compare
discussion.
divorce, right? They want to try to compare the divorce.
Right, because Rabbi Yoshia says,
They want to see if there's any connection.
Right,
to that. If
right.
there's-
so because at this point, we have two different ways.
We're deadlocked here.
That's right. Well, we have two scenarios in which the text may not be written for her sake. We have one opinion which says you're allowed to use the text of a Torah for a Sotah woman. That exists on one opinion on level 2, right? And that is not written for her sake. It's written for the sake of Torah. And yet there is at least one view that says you can cut it out and use it for Sotah. Another end, we have Rabbi Yoshia who says you can actually transfer the text of a Sotah for one woman to another,
That's very liberal.
which is very liberal. Or it's limiting because he says at least it was written for curses and therefore the Torah text can't be used. But nonetheless, it's still be written for one woman and now it's being transferred to another. So if we compare this to the text of the divorce, where you cannot transfer it from one woman to another. If a person writes a divorce text for his wife and then decides I'm not giving it to her. So, and he sells the text now to somebody else who happens to have the same name as him and his wife. So they can always use the same text. You cannot, that other husband cannot use it. So it's not written for them. But yet when it comes to the Sotah, Rabbi Bar Yoshia says you could transfer from one woman to another. Why the difference? That's what we're going to look at tomorrow. Clear?
Yeah.
Okay. So a little mental exercise, and specifically exercising our brains with Hashem's wisdom. That's the main thing here. It's the main thing of learning Gemara. Exercise your minds with Hashem's wisdom. Okay. Have a good day, everybody.
Yeah.